What if we told you that everything you believe to be true about the late Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi is untrue? Your knowledge of him has been deliberately crafted by his adversaries in the West. He was a brutal tyrant who dominated his country with an iron fist, earning him the nickname the Mad Dog of the Middle East in the eyes of the outside world. The truth, however, is far different. His adversary wrote the history books that refer to him as a dictator. Never rely on an enemy's justifications or information. He was a revolutionary leader in Africa who had visions of unifying all of the continent's nations into one. They planned his demise and managed to get him executed because they saw this as a threat to the West. His ideals, however, survived and are still being practiced today. Because of this, African military leaders are driving out the West and establishing their own independence and autonomy. What lessons did Muammar Gaddafi's killing teach other African leaders, and what are they doing differently now as a result? Let's ascertain it and learn the concealed history's genuine details. Number 5. The dream of a united Africa. Muammar Gaddafi conceived the idea for a united Africa. He was dissatisfied with the current situation and was adamant that Africa's true power resided in its unity. The idea of a United States of Africa was central to Gaddafi's grand strategy. It was an audacious notion that caught the attention of leaders all over the African continent. The possible implementation of this goal, however, posed a serious obstacle for Western nations. Do not believe that United Africa intended to invade the West. The situation was actually quite the reverse. The West has a misguided way of thinking, believing that anything that grows powerful in the world threatens it. Everything that is supposed to be more strong than the West gets destroyed by the West. During the 2009 African Union Summit in Libya, a pivotal occurrence took place. Gaddafi stressed the vital need of African unity in his speech and called for the creation of a single African government, a single African currency, and a single African armed force. The West had already determined that day that Gaddafi posed a direct danger to its hegemony. The fourth, total independence and self-reliance. Gaddafi was aware of the distinction between genuine and false independence. He was aware of how France continued to exert authority over the former colonies of Africa. He was therefore aware that independence was a must for unifying Africa. The only way to do this was to provide all African nations economic and self-reliant independence. As a result, Gaddafi's leadership was characterized by a dedication to economic and political independence, having a significant influence on other African leaders. He understood the significance of assisting countries in achieving economic independence, a quality that was uncommon among leaders at the time. African nations have historically depended largely on loans and aid from abroad, which left them defenseless and vulnerable. Libya under Gaddafi offered as a shining example of what can be accomplished when a country places a high priority on self-sufficiency. He made significant investments in Libya's industry, education system, and infrastructure, turning the country from one that was largely reliant on help to one with a diversified and strong economy. African leaders saw firsthand how Gaddafi used Libya's abundant oil resources to finance large-scale development initiatives that not only raised the standard of living for its citizens, but also lessened Libya's vulnerability to economic pressure from outside countries. Gaddafi's proposal for an African currency, the gold dinar, backed by gold reserves, was one groundbreaking initiative. Its purpose was to take the role of the US dollar in African trade, enhancing Africa's economic independence and lowering its reliance on Western currencies. Gaddafi also promoted economic collaboration among African countries. He thought that African nations could forge a more independent continent by combining their resources and knowledge. Economic integration and a reduction in reliance on Western financial institutions were the goals of initiatives like the founding of the African Investment Bank and the African Monetary Fund. A third, a wide range of relationships. The West naturally wants to enslave other nations to its protection and assistance, Because of this, the West only seeks to form alliances with other Western nations. Gaddafi, on the other hand, was a unique leader who recognized the value of forming partnerships for both his nation and all of Africa. Muammar Gaddafi has a talent for forming alliances that frequently goes unrecognized. Gaddafi's approach of forming connections with nations outside the Western orbit. He was not satisfied with restricting his connections to a small number of people, which is nothing short of intriguing. Instead, he trusted in the strength of forging bonds with all nations, big and small. In addition to African nations, Gaddafi also reached out to nations in the Middle East, Asia, and even several in Latin America. He understood that relying only on a small group of strong allies could be a hazardous strategy and go nowhere. So, by broadening his diplomatic network, he was able to forge a new, stronger coalition. He made sure that Libya had a sizable foreign support base. African leaders attentively watched Gaddafi's strategic use of these various ties to make sure that their nation was not left without assistance if the West withdrew. His capacity to negotiate and reach agreements on a variety of levels was crucial in assisting Libya to uphold its independence and economic stability in the face of pressure from Western countries. During the 2008 confrontation between Russia and Georgia, over the breakaway regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, Gaddafi's diplomatic wit was vividly on display. Strategically, Gaddafi partnered with Russia. Throughout this time, this action demonstrated his aptitude for interacting with nations outside the Western sphere of influence. Western countries at the time, especially the United States and the European Union, criticized Russia for its actions in Georgia. Gaddafi, however, openly endorsed Russia's position in the fight, complimented it, and denounced Western engagement in the area. This alliance with Moscow on the international stage showed Gaddafi's audacity to make choices that were advantageous for his nation, even though they opposed the West. Gaddafi's ideas served as the foundation for what is currently occurring in Africa. African leaders in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso are turning away from the West and toward Russia for cooperation as the power of the United States and the European Union in Africa dwindles. For instance, Burkinabe Captain Ibrahim Traoré has discussed possible partnerships with the Russian military. Like Gaddafi II, he has likewise pushed African leaders to put the needs of their citizens first. Effectively handling external influence, Muammar Gaddafi was more than just a dictator. Because of his wit, he was able to handle situations that other leaders were unable to as a diplomat and statesman. He encountered strong opposition and penalties from Western powers throughout his administration. However, he refused to give up and remained steadfast in his defense of Libya's independence. African leaders, who had experienced external pressures firsthand, anxiously watched Gaddafi's tenacious efforts to protect his country's independence. They observed as he fervently defended Africa's right to self-determination, even when it meant taking on international powerhouses. Gaddafi's resistance to outside influences was more than simply a show. It served as a lesson in bravery and tenacity. Gaddafi's capacity to assemble support from like-minded countries around the world, as well as inside Africa, captured the attention of African leaders. This demonstrated the enormous impact a committed leader can have on the world stage. This lesson was pertinent at the time since many African countries were dealing with outside pressure, from political interference to economic coercion. Gaddafi did what the African leaders of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are currently doing. He was the first individual in Africa who was capable of standing his ground in the face of pressure. He was aware that he was alone and that no other leader was coming to his aid. Despite this, Gaddafi kept his promises. The world learned to admire him and his nation because he stood firm. Please remember to thumbs up, share, and subscribe to our channel if you want to see more content about Black identity, culture, history, and civilization. Let's move on now. The fifth, strategic planning's ability. Due to accusations of involvement in several terrorist attacks, notably the infamous 1988 Lockerbie bombing and the 1986 bombing of a Berlin cabaret. Libya struggled with international isolation in the early 2000s. As a result, Libya was subject to UN sanctions that significantly reduced its global engagements. Muammar Gaddafi, the head of the UN, was detained for the same in 2003 and made a deliberate strategic decision to strike a deal with Western countries in an effort to reduce the sanctions and reintegrate Libya into the world. No one could fathom how he managed to do this. It was more than astonishing how he handled everything on his own, interacted with the Western leaders, and obtained what he desired. Gaddafi's remarkable strategic nous was the reason for this. He methodically anticipated and prepared for situations rather than just reacting to them. As an example, in addition to being lucky to have abundant oil resources, Gaddafi's Libya also managed them strategically. In order to finance large-scale economic initiatives that would guarantee the future of the nation, he made use of Libya's rich oil deposits. Despite being a desert country, Libya has seen the development of a sizable water delivery system, guaranteeing that all Libyans have access to water. But it's important to remember that NATO's involvement, which resulted in Gaddafi's terrible death, was focused on destroying this pipeline. Today, both civilian and military officials are attempting to carry on Gaddafi's legacy 12 years after his passing. African leaders have begun strategic planning and are picking their lanes carefully. They are giving their industries growth first priority, making investments in technology and innovation, and putting long-term stability measures into place. Yet why was Gaddafi put to death? The real reason behind NATO's invasion of Syria was disclosed in 2016 after Hillary Clinton's emails were made public. For more than 10 years, the US has supported NATO's invasion of Syria. It became clear that Libya was involved. The goal of the mission was to prevent the development of an independent hard currency in Africa that would remove the continent's monetary reliance on the US dollar, the International Monetary Fund, and the French African franc. This independent currency offered the potential to free Africa from the remaining remnants of colonial exploitation that had long afflicted the continent. The media hailed Hillary Clinton's quick trip to Libya in October 2011 as a victory lap. The US-NATO action had been justified on humanitarian grounds, citing claims of widespread atrocities under Gaddafi's regime, until it was made known that Libyan leader Muammar al-Gaddafi had been captured and brutally killed. Human rights organizations, however, eventually disputed these accusations for a lack of supporting data. Interestingly, documented atrocities did take place in the years following Gaddafi's passing, demonstrating the flaws in the conventional wisdom that Gaddafi was a cruel tyrant. You should be aware that the development of an independent hard currency in Africa, dubbed Gaddafi's gold dinar, had the potential to rid the continent of the final traces of colonial exploitation. Libya has attained economic independence before 2011, boasts its own state-owned bank, food, oil, water, and money. Free healthcare and education were also available, and local democracy was a special feature of life in Libya. The nation even started the Great Man-Made River Project, the largest irrigation system in the world, to transport water from the desert to urban and coastal areas. This approach was Gaddafi's plan for the continent of Africa. However, the US-NATO action resulted in the bombing of Libya's irrigation system, which caused chaos in the country. Clinton's emails exposed a separate purpose for the Libyan conflict, one that seems to have been successful. A third of the 3,000 emails found on Hillary Clinton's personal server came from Sidney Blumenthal, a trusted advisor. According to one of these letters, dated April 2, 2011, Gaddafi's regime possesses 143 tons of gold and a comparable quantity of silver. By creating a pan-African currency based on the Libyan gold dinar, this sizable store of precious metals aimed to give Francophone African nations an alternative to the French franc. The initial disclosed communication said that the worth of this gold and silver trove was above $7 billion. Early in the uprising, French intelligence learned about this plan, which had an impact on President Nicolas Sarkozy's choice to commit France to the attack on Libya. The goals were crystal clear: increasing French influence in North Africa, securing a larger portion of Libya's oil production, addressing domestic political issues in France, strengthening the French military's position globally, and thwarting Gaddafi's plans to usurp France as the leading force in Francophone Africa. These goals notably omitted any discussion of humanitarian issues. The three main forces were cash, power, and oil. Robert Perry, an investigative journalist, also discovered confessions of rebel war crimes. The involvement of special operations trainers in Libya from the start of the unrest, and Al-Qaeda snooping among the US-backed rebels. You should be aware that Western interests did not appreciate Muammar Gaddafi's daring attempt to create an independent African currency. As a result, in 2011, Nicolas Sarkozy, the president of France, referred to the Libyan ruler as a danger to the financial stability of the world. You did hear me correctly. You see, it was considered a menace to the entire world if someone dared to question the cruel French post-colonial financial system in Africa. The query then became relevant. How could a little nation with only 6 million people represent such a serious threat? We need some background to understand this. Banks, not governments, are primarily responsible for the creation of money in Western economies. This practice has persisted for decades thanks to fractional reserve lending. These reserves were at first maintained in gold. President Franklin D. Roosevelt switched domestic gold reserves in 1933 for ones produced by the central bank, although gold nonetheless maintained its significance as a reserve currency on a global scale. In order to internationalize this privately developed monetary system, Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, saw the founding of the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and the World Bank. Paper money could no longer be backed by gold, according an IMF directive. In essence, this indicated that debt-based private generation of the money supply had taken over. Interest-bearing debt. The majority of developing nations accrued IMF debt during the course of the following 50 years as a result of this system's requirement for a constant flow of debtors. These loans have requirements, incorporating structural adjustment programs like asset privatization and austerity measures. As the world's reserve currency after 1944, the US dollar and gold became interchangeable. In the 1970s, when the US could no longer keep the dollar's gold backing, it made an agreement with OPEC to back the currency with oil, giving rise to the petrodollar. It implied that all sales of oil would be made in US dollars, which were subsequently deposited in Wall Street and other foreign institutions. Saddam Hussein of Iraq breached the agreement and started selling oil in euros because he was dissatisfied with the declining value of the dollars they received in exchange for their oil. This action brought about a shift in the government and left the nation in utter ruin. Simply because he contested the petrodollar, we know what happened to Saddam Hussein. You see, the main motivation for these violent interventions was not concern for the welfare of the populace. Fundamentally, they were about money, oil, and the objectives of international banking within Libya. Additionally, Gaddafi broke the contract. Gaddafi devised and funded a scheme to unite the independent African governments under a single gold standard. In addition to rejecting the petrodollar, he also offered his own. By 2023, the African Economic Community will have a unified gold currency, according to plans set forth in 2004 by a Pan-African parliament of 53 countries. Today's world would have a gold dinar and no US dollar if Gaddafi were still alive. The United States was the only nation with a gold currency when NATO invaded Libya. In order to provide water to 70% of the population, it bombed Gaddafi's biggest river project. Wasn't this behavior a war crime, especially coming from the nations who support humanitarianism? Another perplexing element that was highlighted by early observers was clarified by Hillary Clinton's emails. Why did the rebel fighters create their own central bank just a few weeks after beginning their uprising? Robert Wenzel stated in the Economic Policy Journal in 2011 that this implies there are more complex influences at play than just a loose alliance of rebels. I've never heard of a popular movement quickly leading to the establishment of a central bank. If it weren't for the FBI inquiry that led to the revelation of Hillary Clinton's emails, the incident might have remained a suspicious but unproven anomaly, similar to many tales of corruption and fraud. The idea that the violent intervention was more about protecting money, oil, and the interests of global banking than about preserving the safety and security of the Libyan people gains significant support from these emails. How do you feel? Was Muammar Gaddafi a danger to either the West or his own people? Is it true that, like with Saddam Hussein, the West succeeded in having him removed from power? Please share your thoughts on whether the West can repeat this with today's more powerful than ever African leaders. Would you like to see more movies like this one? If so, click the bell icon next to our channel and subscribe. We've made the decision to present videos on a topic that is rarely discussed: the history, culture, and civilization of Black people, as well as evidence of their brilliance. Stay tuned until the next video, and thanks for viewing.